probably been blogging a little bit today. Is that fair to say, Tony?
Draw the line there, brother. I don't play that game. I was listening to you offline here, and you're right. It's we've been doing this, you and I, for going back into the 80s.
Yeah.
Mid to late 80s. Can we admit that? By the way, happy holiday.
Today is...
Well, it's National Letter of Intent Day.
Well, thank you.
So we just kind of segue here, and then after the Pro Bowl, the big boys will go down to the Combine, and then we kind of just morph that into the draft, and so, it's just full-go football all year round.
Well, I know you're excited about the Pro Bowl.
I'll watch it, I'll put it that way.
Are you kidding me?
Oh, I'll have it on, Greg. It's a long, cold winter, brother. Between now and...
Tony, you are crazy, man.
The Hall of Fame game in Canton.
You are crazy.
But you know what? Things have changed, and now, as it pertains to recruiting, things have certainly changed. Even in the last 10 years, I heard you again off air, and I think a couple of things that really stand out is the fact that, so many of these kids now just use this as a springboard, and you can, the early entry into the NFL. And so when you take a kid maybe from a disadvantaged situation, wherever that may be, and he understands that really, if you run a 4.3 40 and you're strong and you have great athletic ability, your best opportunity to take care of yourself and your family will be to play in the league. And, of course, the league being the NFL. So they understand that college is just, some of them, a necessary evil, if you will.
And it's really, to me, Tony, it's up to the coaches, the recruiters, everybody, to tell these kids, you better keep your head on straight, or you turn into Mo Clorette, and you get nothing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good name out of the past. How about Nick Perry, the kid out of Martin Luther King, who had originally, I think, committed to Michigan and then went to USC, and I think SC had him on their depth chart, and I don't even think he was enrolled at the time. I don't think Nick Perry who, by the way, if you go back last year to the Detroit News Top 15, I think he was either the number 1 or 2 player coming out of the state of Michigan. And I heard a report that the SC had him on their depth chart, and he had never even enrolled. I don't even know where he is now. So, I mean, and we could sit here and, brainstorm over 100 different stories of these guys who, just, as you say, they don't have their priorities in line or in order. And you understand that they're going to college for one reason and one reason only, and that is 3 and out. They want to play immediately. So when you see a kid... maybe, I don't even know what example to use because there's so many great programs in the country, but say a kid chooses a lesser program over Michigan or Ohio State or Michigan State. Well, the reality of it is he knows he can play, say, at Minnesota. Minnesota probably, Illinois a couple years ago when they had a great recruiting class because what was the one commodity, Greg, that they could offer that the other Big Ten schools couldn't?
Yeah, well, you said it.
So, and these kids knew it. And if you look at the Illinois roster, you see a lot of those kids now that have left because they fulfilled their 3 years and they're done. They went on to the combine and the draft. So they know that if they come in Minnesota last year, had a great recruiting year for Minnesota. Because again, they had that one thing that a lot of schools in the Big Ten didn't have to offer, and that was immediate playing time. So these kids enroll there, they sign their letter of intent, bam. And you'll see in a couple of years that unless Minnesota can keep this going and they lose that really sound recruiting class after 3 years, that, again, they will be, a very, very average to below average football team. But the other thing, Greg, that's changed, and you and I, again, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, is how ludicrous it is when Under Armour and, some of these high school all-star games, they played a couple weeks ago, and then the kids are going to announce at halftime or midway through the first quarter where they're going to sign or where they're going to go. And they go into the crowd, and they've got family members there with a hat on from 5 different schools. And, the kid takes the hat off of his aunt, puts it on. Oh, no, I was just kidding. And takes the one off his sister and puts that one on. No, I was just kidding there, too. And then takes the one off his brother, and then he ends up going to Florida, It's like a shell game. And it's ridiculous, and that's the 15 minutes of fame that a lot of these kids, really cherish, and it's what the market bears, buddy. So, we can sit here and criticize it and talk about it and how it's changed, but, when you've got, CBS, the college channel, and you've got ESPN2 and ESPNU, all, basically setting up shop at various universities across the country today to just, for that fact, to announce where these kids are going. Obviously, there are people out there that want to see it, so it is what it is.
And, Tony, a majority you'll never hear from again?
You won't, and you know what, that is so true. And you could go down the list of all the guys that, were the number one rated kid. I did a little homework here, I guess from 03, the top rated recruit coming out of high school was a kid named Kyle Wright.
Yep.
Now, if you really follow the game closely, then you say, oh, you know what, I remember that kid. Didn't he play at Miami, at the U? Yeah, he did. He didn't have a great career, but coming out of high school, everybody thought that he was certainly, a John Elway, Dan Marino type guy. And you're going to see names of guys that you do recognize. Ernie Sims was one of those kids. Reggie Bush was one of those kids. But for every one of those guys, you've got a Tony Hills, who ended up going to Texas. I have no idea who or where he is. Or an Eric Young out of Tennessee, who was a highly recruited kid. Or a Nate Robinson out of Miami. Or a Whitney Lewis out of USC. I mean, those are 5 or 6 kids I just listed in the top 10. And I don't even remember them having decent college careers, much less playing in the NFL. So, I mean, you're right. A lot of these kids will never, ever live up to their rating. And I guess the best example I can give, Greg, let me bring it home for a lot of the listeners who remember Larry Capers, the kid out of Battle Creek. Rivals has him as a 4-star kid. Lumen played him twice. The first time I saw the game, they held him to 53 yards, slammed him. And what was the second game? They held him in check.
Yeah.
And here he is, a 4-star rated kid who everybody in the country wanted. And, if you paid attention and you happened to go to the game, you saw Lumen Christie, right? Did a pretty good job on that kid.
Absolutely.
And yet he's one of the 4-star kids that a lot of Michigan State fans are really hanging their hat on.
So you don't know. You just don't, it's imperfect science.
It really is, and too many times I think the universities get caught up. There are so many of these recruiting services now available. And look, if you're Rich Rodriguez or you're Jim Tressel or Mark D'Antonio, you obviously do not have enough time, and the NCAA restrictions don't allow it. You can't go out and see all of these kids and watch them play. I mean, you have to refer and depend on either a recruiting service or a word of mouth. A former coach in the case of Michigan, Thomas Wilcher, as I mentioned yesterday, 3 of his kids from Cass Tech are going to Michigan, so he certainly understands the Michigan, program and what it stands for, and so his kids bought into that, and they're all going to Michigan. So as a head football coach, you can't possibly go out and watch all these kids play. So you do have to depend on what people say or what recruiting services, how they rank them. And then, you have your camps now, and again, that's really changed too, Greg, over the years. Michigan State, Ohio State, they have all these camps. I think they can invite these kids. I don't know the NCAA rules off the top of my head. I think the kids can be invited, but certainly the university can't pay for that trip. But, I mean, if you're a kid, from somewhere in the upper part of the state, and you get a letter from Michigan that says they're looking at you and they'd like to have you attend the camp. They can't pay for it, but they're going to keep an eye out for you. That's probably going to be enough to get you down to the camp in most cases. So
probably feed you well.
Feed you well. You're going to meet a lot of guys that you're going to compete with and against. You're going to meet a lot of current and past players, and obviously talk to the coaches. So it's a win-win there. And then obviously the university and the coaches get a good up close and personal look at these kids, and they get to talk to them and get to know them a little bit. And I think that's the other thing that's changed more than anything as well, is that Texas probably had their class, put a bow on it here probably 4 or 5 months ago. They were done, maybe with the addition of a couple late kids that they were in on, but for the most part, I think Texas had about 20 recruits as of September, and they're probably in line for 2010 to do pretty much the same thing.
Are you taking calls, Tony?
Sure.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Tony. Hi, Greg. This is Brad Bashinsky. I wanted to just get Tony's take on what he thought of Michigan's class so far this year.
Sure.
Thanks, Brad.
Great question, Brad. Thanks for the call. I will tell you that Pearlie Graves, a kid at Michigan, he's a kid out of Oklahoma, defensive tackle. He had been wavering the last couple of days, and he indeed today signed with Texas Tech. Now, they're waiting right now on another defensive tackle out of Louisiana, DeQuinta Jones. Of the two, DeQuinta Jones has been rated higher than Pearly Graves. You say, well, okay, it's sour grapes. No, it's reality. Both of those kids have wavered, and my understanding is that 1:30 Eastern Standard Time, listen to this like we're breaking some big news of that, DeQuinta Jones will announce between two schools, Michigan and Arkansas. Now, why is that important? Well, as of yesterday, he had it narrowed down to 5 schools, okay? So overnight he slept on it apparently and met with his family, and now it comes down to Arkansas and Michigan.
Where's he from?
He's from Louisiana.
Boy. Arkansas is pretty close.
Getting back to Brent's original question, I think that they're defensively, had they been able to get Pearly Graves, from everything you hear, he's a very good football player. He's a 4-star guy. So now you factor that in with William Campbell, the big 5-star guy. He's kind of the pearl, so to speak. He's the kid out of Cass Tech. And then maybe a DeQuinta Jones along the defensive front. And 2 defensive ends that they really, really like. Anthony Lalota, kid out of Princeton, New Jersey. He just sounds like a tough kid. And the other kid I saw play in the Under Armour game, Craig Rowe. Now, my understanding is that he has not signed yet. There are 5 kids who have committed, but as of yet to sign. Now, that was about an hour and a half ago, so maybe they faxed in their letter of intent. And if they did, good for them. But Craig Rowe is a 4-star defensive end out of Scottsdale, Arizona. I did get a chance to see him play in the Under Armour game, and he's pretty good. He's a pretty good football player, and he's a kid. So if you factor in all of those defensive linemen that I just mentioned, with the exception of Pearly Graves, they will have a pretty good D-line. I mean, this is a good recruiting year for Michigan along the front, and that's something, as you go back through the years, they haven't always had. Now, again, Brett, Tate Forcier, the quarterback out of San Diego, he's enrolled at Michigan. He's there already, signed his letter. He's good to go. There are about 6 or 7 of those guys. It's a class, as you look at it, there's only one so-called 5-star kid, and that's Will Campbell. But there are a lot of 4-star kids. Offensive line, they brought in at least 4 of those guys. They got a late commit the other night, Quentin Washington, a kid out of South Carolina, 4-star kid, 6'3", 315 pounds. A lot of size up front.
Yeah.
Rodriguez has talked about the fact that they don't need to be as big as they do quick and well-conditioned, but he brought in an offensive front this year that's pretty big. Taylor Lewin, a kid out of Arizona. They brought in 2 kids from Arizona this year. He's 6'7", 272. He's an offensive lineman. As you look at the list, I guess the one thing that jumps out at me is the running backs that they brought in are diminutive, so to speak.
Very small.
So it just, I guess, speaks to the fact that you're not going to line up in the I formation under Rich Rodriguez at Michigan and pound the football.
You're not going to pound it.
So I guess that's the other thing. Again, in-state, Brent, and again, I'm speaking now in regard to Brent's question, of the top 15 kids, I think Michigan brought in 3 from the state of Michigan.
Yeah, only 4 kids from Michigan.
4 kids, okay. And Tom Lemming the other day addressed that. I heard him talk about it, and he basically, pulled no punches. He said Michigan did a horrific job in state. And they didn't really, commit to the state, and he felt like this could, at some point, it's going to be something that could affect them if they don't start doing a much better job. Now, whether or not Rodriguez thought this was a good year for football in the state of Michigan, I don't know. But the bottom line is he brought in 3 kids from Cass Tech, and then he brought from, where did he bring them in from?
Inkster.
Yeah, I think he's a wideout.
Well, I think the bottom line, Rich doesn't probably have a real great handle on the state of Michigan yet.
That may be. Cameron Gordon is the wideout from Inkster, and he's supposed to be pretty good.
Yeah, he's impressive.
So you're talking about 4 kids, and this just goes back to if you're old enough to remember, of course, George Perlis talking back in, I think it was '83, that they knocked Michigan's socks off in the state of Michigan, and that year they really did, and that really parlayed that into a Rose Bowl trip. So I don't know what that means for this year. I think what you just mentioned, Greg, the fact that Rodriguez probably doesn't have a real good feel for kids in the state of Michigan. The other thing, too, is they had a very good year last year, Michigan. And once they start to exercise their dominance, so to speak, and get back where they need to be, then obviously they'll be on the top of everybody's list. in the state. If you, I think the News or the Free Press today ran a piece, and of course they always do this every year. They ask the kids that go somewhere else. For example, if you went to state, they say, why not Michigan? You know, a couple of the guys say, well, they're arrogant and the coaches are standoffish and so on and so forth. But, you know, again, Greg, how long has that been? You know, that's been something that's been said about the Michigan coaches for a long, long time, and the Michigan program for a long time.
Tony, I think you have one issue that you do have. There's only one quarterback there.
Yeah.
I'm very surprised. Now, that's not to say somebody doesn't jump on the bandwagon late today, but that's risky, isn't it?
I agree. I'll tell you what, I said this to you yesterday when we were talking. I think Tate Forcier is a kid they really, really like, and obviously he is the future of Michigan football. But when you have one recruit that you bring in, now they may sign somebody today late who is a defensive back / quarterback, or maybe they'll bring in a two-star guy, and it goes, you know, I have to remind the listeners that, you know, Pat White at West Virginia was a rival two-star guy, and he's probably one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the country, and certainly one of the best spread offense or spread option type quarterbacks in the country, and he was a two-star guy coming out of high school. So I think, you know, you can get lost in these ratings or rankings, but, you know, by the same token, you do have to have players, and Forcier is a 4-star guy. He's a kid that committed to Michigan back in the fall, never wavered, and he's one of the kids that's enrolled now and will go through spring football. So I know just based on that, and if you talk to the insiders, I don't, but if you got down and were lucky enough to get into Schembechler Hall, they'd probably tell you that they love this kid and he's the future of Michigan football. But
he gets hurt, where do you go?
There you go. If he gets hurt, where are you? I mean, you got nothing. Nothing. You know, you're going to be playing with Sheridan again at quarterback. And I don't know that that's something that...
or if he gets homesick, where do you go?
You know, that's something that, you know, I think Michigan football fans would probably rather not think about those things. And even though Steve Threet and Nick Sheridan were gamers and did everything that, you know, Rodriguez asked him to do, you certainly don't want to, you know, you don't want to see that movie again next year.
Yeah. Tony, we touched on it yesterday, Michigan State doing very well. I think it was... Scouts Inc. They had them at number 13 or 14 in the entire country. You mentioned yesterday they might be number 2 in the Big Ten. You have to take your hat off to them. This is, on paper anyway, it looks like about the best class they've had going in maybe a couple decades.
Absolutely. Tom Renning has Michigan State right now. If things ended this moment, he has them at number 2. Rivals.com, and this is in the Big Ten now. Rivals.com has Michigan State at number 3, and Scout.com has Michigan State at number 4.
Okay.
And again, I mean, that's better than I think across the board. Now, you know, usually one of those services will say, well, Michigan State got some better players than this guy thinks, and so on and so forth. But I think across the board, as you look at those 3 services, this is probably the best that I've ever seen Michigan State finish.
They really did well in Ohio.
They did well in Ohio. Obviously, we talked about the fact that they did very, very well here in the state of Michigan.
Yeah, well, they certainly cleaned house here.
Well, I think they made it a real point of emphasis, Greg, as you know. I mean, you have to. If you're going to get the kind of kids that they got, you really have to say, look, we're committed to this state. And I think it sends a message, too. It sends a message to Michigan. It sends a message to a lot of the players here and a lot of the universities that come in here and get an occasional player like a Penn State or Ohio State that, hey, listen, we're going to try to close down the borders and keep these guys at home. And I think for the most part, Michigan State was able to do that with a lot of these kids. You know, Deion Sims, who the News has as the number 2 blue chip. He's a kid out of Orchard Lake St. Mary's. He's going to Michigan State. I don't know if he's going to play basketball. He's an outstanding 2-sport star. In fact, I think he even plays baseball, but I think he's going to focus on football and basketball. I don't know if Izzo told him he could play or wants him to play, but he, late last week, decided he's going to Michigan State. Larry Caper, we talked about him. Edwin Baker, who is a rival, top 100 player out of Oak Park. He's a running back. Now, I will tell you that he had some injury problems last year, late in the year, and didn't play very much, and I don't think he played much in the playoffs. The kid that I think they're really counting on is the kid out of Midland, Andrew Maxwell, the quarterback, who by all accounts was the best quarterback in the state. You go down the list, and Blake Treadwell, a kid out of East Lansing, obviously that's the proximity there works in Michigan State's favor. Chris Norman, a linebacker out of Detroit Renaissance. So they really came in here, Greg, and decided that they were going to commit to the state And come hell or high water, they were going to walk out of here with the best players, and for the most part, in this state, they did that.
Plus, they got a real break when the best player in Iowa chucked the Hawkeyes and for some reason took Michigan State, the big offensive lineman, David Barron.
Yeah, David Barron is a kid. He's about 6'8", 290 pounds, just a biscuit under 300. And you know, again, it's the same kind of class. Michigan State, and whether people want to admit it or not, you know, Michigan very seldom will go up into the upper part of the state. I don't think Michigan's ever gone into the UP, and not that there are any kids from the UP in this class, but I mean, Michigan is going to be more of a national school, for good or bad. That's just the way it is. And Michigan State, as you know, they've always felt like, listen, we need to get, you know, we need to stay home here. Our brand is not going to sell as well in Arizona or California or occasionally Florida as Michigan's brand will, and that's true. Whether you know people like it or not, it's the reality of it. Now that doesn't mean that Michigan State won't get an occasional kid out of Florida. They certainly will. In fact, they have one coming in this year from Plant City, and he's the only one that I can think of. But
they got two defensive players from Florida.
Yeah, you know what they did? They got another kid who's considered an athlete.
Yeah,
Julius Jones.
But 10 4-stars, that's way ahead of what anything they've done that I can remember past couple decades.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? They dipped into Ohio too, and went back to the roots of Mark D'Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I think Michigan State's game is, look, we're going to occasionally get a kid out of Florida now and then, and we'll occasionally get a kid maybe from somewhere else in the country who has grown up being a Michigan State guy. But we have got to focus on Michigan, Ohio, and I don't know about Indiana, but they'll get a kid or two from Indiana. I think they've got one this year coming in from Indiana.
If you are a fanatic about this sort of thing, ESPNU, their coverage started at 10 o'clock today, will run wall-to-wall until 7. I thought I heard Rich Rodriguez may make an appearance on there. I'm not positive. But they'll have, you know, some of the top coaches will be on there. And many of the late deciders are making their announcement on that program today.
Mm-hmm. And again, that plays into, you know, look, this is our 15 minutes of fame. Let's milk it for what it's worth.
Yep.
And, you know, if it gets us on ESPNU or on, you know, Lemming Show or whatever, then we got to do that. You know, I'd be remiss. We talked about Michigan State finishing, you know, 2 and 3 and 4 in Lemming Rivals and Scout.com. But I also want to talk about the Tom Lemming's top, well, obviously 11 in the Big Ten. He's got Ohio State 1, Michigan State 2, Michigan 3, Penn State 4, Northwestern 5. Maybe a little surprise there. Illinois 6. That may be a little bit of a surprise. If you recall, going back a couple years ago, you know, they were number 2. Mm-hmm. You've got Wisconsin at 7, Minnesota at 8. A surprise in as much as last year again. They not only were the surprise of the Big Ten, but basically the surprise of the country that Minnesota recruited so well. Now, a lot of these young kids playing, what we talked about early, there's not as much playing time, so now Minnesota checks in at 8. Number 9, Purdue. 10, Iowa. Surprise there, Greg?
Yes.
And number 11, rounding out the top 11 in the Big Ten, is Indiana. So
that's not a surprise.
That's not a surprise, but Iowa, I think, is a little bit of a surprise. Lemming has them at 10. Rivals.com has them at 10. Again, this is in the Big Ten. And Scout.com has Iowa at 11. Now, Iowa has never been notorious for having and posting great recruiting classes, but I don't know that I can recall them ever finishing this low, again, across the board. That's the consensus among these 3 top services, and that, I think, is a little bit of a surprise.
And Penn State, Tony?
Penn State, depending again, Lemming has them at 4, Rivals has them at 4, and Scout.com has them at 2. So, Ohio State, I think the consensus is, and by the way, Rivals.com has Ohio State, now this is in the country, finishing with the number 1 rated recruiting class. Mm-hmm. And Ohio State last, I'm going to say 2 nights ago, ended up really rounding out. Now, they may be in on a couple more kids, but they really finished strong. They picked up an offensive lineman that just about everybody wanted. I think Michigan was really in on the kid, too. Obviously, he's going to Ohio State, and I'm trying to find him here. Big offensive lineman Marcus Hall. And he was a 4-star rated kid out of Cleveland. I think he came down to Michigan and Ohio State, and he announced, I think 2 nights ago, Ohio State. So if that's the bow that they put on the recruiting class, it's a real good way to end it.
And take it for what it's worth. You never hear much about Wisconsin,
No.
and they're always very good.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they get tough kids. You know, Big Two, you're talking about Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa. You know, I thought Iowa's bowl performance against South Carolina, albeit South Carolina was not very good this year, I think it was kind of the poster child for Iowa football. They just had a lot of overachievers, a lot of real tough, hard-nosed kids, a lot of tweener kids. You know, Greg, when you look at the Iowa D-line, you usually see a lot of guys that are about 6'3", 250, and that usually indicates that in high school, maybe they were a linebacker. A lot of those kids were fullbacks. Michigan used to do this all the time under Bo. They would take a fullback / linebacker and make him into a D lineman because he was athletic and you know, they played a gap control type defense. And Iowa does that. I mean, they just bring in kids that are about 6'20", guys who, on paper, you know, Michigan may not want all their guys, Ohio State may not want all their guys, but those guys are just tough, hard-nosed. They wrestle. They're just tough, hard-nosed kids. So, you know, do you read in too much that they finished, you know, in the top 5 in the Big Ten? I don't know. I just can't recall, as I'm thinking back, I can't recall them being that poorly rated.
Tony, just a minute or so left. Thumbnail on Notre Dame. They probably did quite well.
Well, you know what? I saw where Rivals had them at number 25. I think Notre Dame there, that surprised me. That really surprised me because as you scroll down and you look at the Rivals 100 or the 250, you see a lot of Notre Dame kids in there. So I was really surprised at that, but I don't think, and again, Rivals looks at the 5-star kids that you have. I don't think that Notre Dame had any 5-star kids. Now, understand that they are in on about a half a dozen of those kids today. And so, you know, Notre Dame could probably go from 25 to number 10 in a hurry if they ended up getting 4 or 5 of those guys. But I was surprised. I don't know, and of course we'll know more when the ratings come out tomorrow after all these kids have their press conferences, but as of about 2 hours ago, Notre Dame was sitting at number 25 according to Rivals.
Tony, we're out of time. Hang on for me.
You got it.
Tony Zerke joining us.